Hi everybody and welcome to Mark Overanalyzes Film. Today I will be overanalyzing arguably the most iconic film of the last 30 years, Pulp Fiction, which is of course celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. To be honest, I actually thought Pulp Fiction would be harder to break down. But one thing that has been challenging is structuring the overanalysis without the entire podcast turning into some kind of narrative bowl of spaghetti. Now, that is at least partly because of two things. One, excitingly for me, because yes, I am this big of a nerd, this is the first multi-protagonist story that I have overanalyzed for the podcast. And two, this is broken up into 5 different stories with different timelines. Getting the briefcase, Vincent and Mia, the gold watch, the Bonnie situation, and the diner. Fortunately though, I have been highly motivated because I draw inspiration equally from 2 sources, curiosity and spite. Because I cannot explain it, but nothing drives me crazier than people saying something like that Quentin Tarantino or Pulp Fiction, quote unquote, breaks the rules. I don't know what these people think the rules are, or who they think made these rules, but allow me to be clear. If there are rules, Pulp Fiction does not break them. So what I'd like to do here is slightly different from my usual structure. Normally, I would define the protagonist, then I'd go through the sequences of the film, and then I'd talk about the things I learned along the way. But multi-protagonist stories tend to be, as story theorist Emanuel Oberg would put it, theme-led. So Vincent, Butch, and Jules might be having their own separate adventures, but the thematic arc is utterly consistent across the whole film, which is what allows Pulp Fiction to really cohere so well and have such narrative unity. It is the thing which stops it from, feeling like just one thing happening after another. So, with that in mind, first I'm going to define what the theme or the thematic argument of Pulp Fiction is. Then I'll show how Pulp Fiction dramatizes this across a 5-act structure, and even structures its shorter stories in 5 acts. Finally, I'll talk about the subtler aspects, maybe, of the structure of Pulp Fiction, and what I think makes it Quentin Tarantino's masterpiece. Okay, so, first things first, what is this thematic argument of Pulp Fiction that I keep talking about? Or basically, what is Pulp Fiction actually about? Now, all stories are about change, or the threat of change. Not all work like this, but in the majority of stories, the protagonist begins with a flaw, or a lack of some kind, and through the process of the story, they learn a lesson and they embrace a new way of being. I'm going to call this their need, okay? So, the protagonist has a flaw, and this causes them to behave one way at the start of our story, but then they embrace what they need to overcome that flaw, and this causes them to behave a different way at the end of the story. And this is not only what gives us our kind of beginning, middle, and end, or our before journey of change and after structure, it's also that change means something. That change is our thematic argument. That's why Star Wars is so empowering. Luke Skywalker goes from being a callow youth to someone who learns to believe in himself, and in so doing, the film convinces us that we should believe in ourselves. That's why you kind of come out of Star Wars on a bit of a high. This is also why, the end of Fleabag, season 2, is so bittersweet. Fleabag starts that season using an imaginary audience as a kind of disassociating crutch because of her loneliness. She's talking to us because nobody else can really talk to her. So, we have this moment right at the start where she says something like, I've been here for 40 minutes and nobody has asked me a question, or something like that. But then, just as she says that, the priest turns around and asks her a question. And the two of them go on this adventure together where they really have this connection. At the end of that season, that same priest has broken her heart. But because of her journey, because of their real connection, she is now still brave enough to not revert to disassociating from the pain of real life. And so, the thematic argument of Fleabag is essentially, it is better to have loved and lost. So, what about Pulp Fiction? Well, 20 minutes into a 149-minute runtime, at the end of our Act 1, Jules kills someone for money. 60 minutes in, Vincent saves someone's life because he kind of has to. 105 minutes in, Butch saves someone's life even though it would actually be much easier not to. 130 minutes in, at the end of our second act, Jules is washed clean of the blood on his hands. He is essentially baptized and born again. And then finally, 148 minutes in, Jules chooses a complete inversion of his first major act. Rather than kill someone for money, he gives someone all of his money in order not to kill them. You can hear the 5 acts already, right? And you can probably hear the journey of change. So you can probably term the thematic argument any number of ways, but Pulp Fiction is certainly about the idea of redemption. To be specific, I'm going to paraphrase our principal protagonist and say that it is something like as follows. In a world of sin, you have to try to be the shepherd. Okay, so now that I've outlined what I consider to be the thematic argument of the film, let's have a look at the 5 acts of Pulp Fiction and how they trace this argument. Okay, so in a 5-act structure, Act 1 is generally defined by 3 things. First of all, we have our opening that shows the world as it is and our protagonist's place in it. And Pulp Fiction's opening does an incredible job of showing us the world as it is. Before we really get the story started, we have a kind of prologue to the prologue, a scene where we see Pumpkin and Honey Bunny plan to stick up the restaurant. And this does 2 things really cleverly. One, it shows that life as it is thing that we've been talking about. It shows just how casually beset by vice and violence this world is, thus setting up the main counter-argument of the film and showing how it is in the ascendancy right now. But secondly, if you listen carefully, this scene is setting up the argument of our film, or at least posing the question. The very reason why Pumpkin and Honey Bunny choose to stick up the restaurant is because they don't believe there will be any shepherds here.
I bet you could cut down on the hero factor in a place like this.
Correct. Same as banks, these places are insured. Manager, he don't give a fuck. He's just trying to get you out the door before you start plugging the diners. Waitresses, fucking forget it. No way they're taking a bullet for the register. Busboys, some wetback, getting paid $1.50 an hour. Really give a fuck you're stealing from the owner? Customers sitting there with food in their mouths. They don't know what's going on. One minute they're having a Denver omelette. Next minute someone's sticking a gun in their face.
Subtly, the scene is asking us, are they correct? Or will there be a shepherd? And then we switch to Vincent and Jules. And they seem to be no different. They talk about McDonald's on their way to a good old henchman murder spree. But just before they meet Big Brained Brett and co., we have the second thing that we need in Act 1, our inciting incident. Now, normally I would say that the inciting incident is the event without which our story as it is would not happen. But we actually have 3 different stories here, really, and they all have an inciting incident. What we need here, though, at least, is the event that will trigger the first of these adventures, so that we can at least kick off into Act 2. And so, exactly halfway through this 14-minute story of Jules and Vincent doing a hit, Vincent reveals that he has to take out their boss's wife, Mia Wallace. We've just been told that Tony Rocky Horror got killed for giving Mia a foot massage, and Vincent is immediately defensive about this not being a date. This can only be trouble. But we're not there yet, because before that we have the third thing that defines Act 1. This act ends and Act 2 begins with our protagonist beginning the adventure or journey that was spurred by the inciting incident. And so our Act 1 ends with Jules intimidating the crap out of a room full of guys out of their element and he shoots the big brains right out of the back of Brett's head. So now we know that the henchmen were looking for the briefcase and were there to negotiate with and kill Marcellus Wallace's unfortunate business associates. This has answered a kind of subtle tension we've had for this act, which is, what are these guys actually doing? And even though it's delayed for now, it's the moment that kicks off Jules's second and third act journeys. And so, it's time we ended Act 1 and we begin Act 2. Now, just to note here, I hate switching between terminology for 3 acts and 5 acts. I think it's kind of messy. But again, I think Pulp Fiction is a perfect example of 5-act structure, so I do want to think about it in those terms. At the same time, I prefer to think of the middle of our film as a kind of long Act 2, rather than Acts 2, 3, and 4, because normally in a story there's a unity of purpose here across the middle of our story that gives our story a kind of before journey of change and after shape. And even though Pulp Fiction breaks this middle part into 3 separate stories, I hope that I can impress upon you that it still has this unifying element to it. So, here, just to make it sound as much like maths homework as possible, I'm going to call the 3 acts here in the middle Acts 2A, 2B, and 2C. So, if I say Act 2, I'm really talking about the whole thing, right? From minute 21 to minute 133. But Act 2A, in this case, will be the story of Vincent and Mia. Act 2B is the story of the gold watch. And Act 2C is the Bonnie situation. Okay, so, explanation of jargon done. Act 2A is also defined, just like Act 1, by 3 aspects. First, we have what we can call a what's the plan scene, because the story has gotten going and we now need to tell the audience what to expect from the rest of it. So you might notice that Pulp Fiction actually sets up 3 stories in one within a few minutes here. It's really cleverly done, I think. The first act ends where Act 2C will pick up in 90 minutes' time. Then we cut to Butch taking payment to throw the fight while having some needle with Vincent, which is going to set up Act 2B. And finally, Vincent begins encountering some worrying reactions when telling people he's taking out Mia Wallace, which sets up Act 2A. And all while Jules and Vincent are wearing the clothes that we will see them acquire in the last third of the film. So in this 5-minute stretch, Pulp Fiction is signposting loads about where it is going. Again, it's just really clever. But the most interesting thing about Act 2A, to my mind, is the second and third aspects. Because it's here where we always have a refusal of the call and then an acceptance of the call. Now, put simply, change is hard and nobody really likes it. So the protagonist is first going to try not to change. But then, finally, at the end of this act, they're going to make an unconscious move towards their need. Now, it's unconscious because it tends to be reactive or not thought through. It might surprise the character themselves that they did it, which is why it is so often a moment of awakening for them. The kind of example par excellence is The Godfather, where Michael is initially saying, no, I want nothing to do with my family business, but then he suddenly has to pretend to be a mafioso in order to protect his father in the hospital, and he really takes to it and decides he really likes it. And so, in the next couple of scenes, he's like, hey, how can I kill some people? So it's this real moment of awakening for him. But again, first we have the refusal of the call. So here in Pulp Fiction, Jules and Vincent have murdered someone in cold blood. Butch takes money to throw a fight. Jules picks on Vincent. Vincent picks a fight with Butch. And then the same man goes to buy heroin from local entrepreneur and choco enthusiast Lance. So yeah, not a whole lot of shepherding going on here, right? But then Vincent meets Mia and actually starts to bond with her. And even though he has real chemistry with her, he tells himself that he's just going to go home and jerk off like any good shepherd would do. Of course, as he gives himself a stern talking to, Mia overdoses on his heroin by accident. And so Vincent races her to Pillar of the Community Lance, strikes her in the heart with an adrenaline shot, and saves her life.
I'm curious about that myself.
This ain't no fucking joke, man. Am I gonna kill her?
No, she's supposed to come out of it like that. It's... All right, count to 3. All right, ready? 1. 2. 3!
So you can see how all of this is reactive and not entirely conscious, right? Vincent kinda has to react in the moment to save Mia, or his boss would have him killed. But it's still saving someone's life. So we've had a textbook first unconscious move towards the protagonist's need here. And so at that, it's time to end Act 2A and enter the heart of our film, Act 2B. Act 2B is the middle of our film, and as such, it is really defined by the midpoint. So, we've had our first unconscious move towards our story's need, and you might notice that Butch is literally unconscious when his story picks up again, and he appears to be remembering a call to do better. His father and Captain Coons truly suffered to get him the watch his great-grandfather bought in Tennessee. So that's our starting point, and we're going to build on that, because we're headed towards the midpoint of Pulp Fiction, and the platonic ideal for a midpoint does several things all at once. 1, it should generally raise the stakes of our story. 2, it should foreshadow our eventual climax. But most importantly, 3, it should contain the protagonist's first conscious move towards their need. More on that in just a moment. This part of Pulp Fiction is a little bit messier in terms of structure. Normally our midpoint happens bang in the middle of our film, but here the Gold Watch is its own whole story that runs right through the middle of Pulp Fiction. And so the biggest moment of that story is going to be its own mini climax rather than its midpoint. So I think you can make a case that the midpoint of Pulp Fiction is the midpoint of its middle story, or it's really the climax. I'll discuss both, but as ever, let me just remind everyone, it really doesn't matter. I know I give timestamps and I talk about all these, plot beats and whatever, but the point is not to hit the formula. The point is to have an overall shape to your story that creates a sense of cohesion, unity, and flow. So whether, the midpoint comes at the midpoint of the Gold Watch or at the end, it doesn't really matter because the flow of the story is very much present. Anyways, first we have the midpoint of that middle story. At 86 minutes into a 140-minute runtime, Butch realizes that Fabienne forgot his father's watch and he decides to go back for it. Now, this does raise the stakes for sure, because Butch is almost certainly going to run into some mobsters, but while it definitely is a call to something greater than a life of taking the money and running, it doesn't really feel like it does a great job of foreshadowing our climactic action. Neither does it really feel like it's that, thought out or conscious. And nor does it feel like it's that much of a build of what Vincent did in the last story. But what about the climax of this act? Well, Butch gets kidnapped along with his sworn enemy Marcellus, but then manages to free himself and is ready to make a run for it. And then, in this world of sin and self-interest, Butch decides to turn around and save Marcellus's life instead. So, raising the stakes, Butch makes a conscious, substantial decision to be the shepherd, just like Jules will in another 45 minutes' time. Now that is a midpoint. And just to note here, in his speech to Little Butch just after the first unconscious move, Captain Coons talked about how his great-grandfather bought his watch in a small general store in Tennessee on his way to do his duty for his country. Now, I've spoken about this before, but there's a general rule of thumb in filmmaking that when things are going well, things are generally moving from left to right on the screen. And often the reverse is true. If our protagonist is doing, the wrong thing, they're often moving from right to left. And so, as Butch moves to run away, he moves right to left. But then he stops and looks back. He now looks from left to right, feeling the call to do the right thing. And what is right behind him and just to his right in this shot? A license plate from Tennessee. The honor and decency of his ancestry is calling him to do the right thing. So he does, and for this he is rewarded, which is typical of what we call the honeymoon period that is triggered by the midpoint. Marcellus agrees that their blood feud is over. He walks out to discover a chopper just waiting for him, and he and Fabienne ride off into the sunset. So, we've had our midpoint, we're in our honeymoon period, and Butch's story is told. So it's time we end Act 2B and we enter Act 2C. Act 2C is the final part of our long second act, and it is generally a kind of bridge from the honeymoon period to the low point of our story. Now that term, the low point, might be a little bit misleading. So let me define it as this. The low point is the moment in our story at the end of our long second act when the protagonist no longer believes the counter-argument of the story, but the argument seems impossible. In other words, they have changed from the beginning of their story, but they don't really know what to do with that change. That's why it feels like a low point. The protagonist no longer has their old, coping mechanism, their way of being in the world that was, not great but okay. But they haven't figured out how to be this new person they are meant to be. They don't really know how to be without their coping mechanism. So they're kind of caught between two worlds and they don't really have anything to cling on to, which gives it this sort of hopelessness feeling sometimes, or, that sense that like everything is lost. So this story is going to take us from the honeymoon to this moment. Thus, just like earlier on, when there was a kind of afterglow from Vincent making his first unconscious move that affected Butch's story, here, the honeymoon period from the end of Butch's story drifts on into the Bonnie situation, almost as if it were a reward. For Butch choosing to save Marcellus Wallace's life, Jules and Vincent appear to be the recipient of a life-saving miracle, and Jules believes it to be just that, and renounces his life of crime. But our story is not over yet, and this is the bridge to the low point. So of course, Vincent shoots Marvin in the face, and just like that, Jules now has a huge problem.
Oh, what the fuck's happening? Oh, man, shit, man!
Oh, man, I shot Marvin in the face.
Why the fuck you do that?
Well, I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident.
Oh, man, I seen some crazy-ass shit in my time, but this...
Chill out, man. I told you it was an accident. You went over a bump or
Hey,
something.
the car ain't hit no motherfucking bump.
Hey, look, man, I didn't mean to shoot the son of a bitch. The gun went off. I don't know why.
Well, look at this fucking mess, man. We're on a city street in broad daylight here.
Believe it, man.
Well, believe it now, motherfucker. We gotta get this car off the road. Cops tend to know this shit like you're driving a
Just
car
take
against
it
this
to
fucking blood.
He has recanted, but he is now literally covered in the bloody consequences of his former evil deeds. What is he going to do? Tell the cops he has renounced murdering for money? So you can hear it, right? He's changed, but he's got no way of acting on that change. We're not quite there yet, but we're definitely nearing the end of Act 2 and that low point. So, Jules crashes Jimmy's, and Jimmy, a civilian, absolutely rejects and insults Jules at all times. Civilian life wants nothing to do with Jules. And so Jules, who will soon tell Pumpkin that he's trying real hard to be the shepherd, has to get help from the wolf. This mob fixer then takes charge and orchestrates their tidy up. And then we have the final moment of Act 2. At the end of Act 1, Jules murdered 2 people in cold blood for money. But then, over the course of Act 2, he changed and recanted. Now right here, at the end of our long journey, he is literally washed clean of the blood on his hands. He is baptized and born again in an extremely Pulp Fiction kind of way.
Don't worry, we're taking it with us. Jim, the soap.
Vincent.
Okay, gentlemen, you've both been to county before, I'm sure. Here it comes.
God damn, the water's fucking cold.
Better you than me, gentlemen. Don't be afraid of the soap. Spread it around.
Get him up there a little bit.
Hey, man,
Vincent's
get out of my hair. Come on, do it. God damn it, do it.
Towel.
But it's worth noting, this man who wants to be a shepherd has been absolved by a wolf, and he has no plan on what he would do if he weren't a hitman, and he's still surrounded by a life of inequity, tyranny, and evil. He no longer believes the counter-argument, but the argument seems impossible. And so at that, what can he do but go for breakfast? And as we follow him, we end our long Act 2, and we enter Act 3. Act 3 has a false resolution and a true resolution. And so in our false resolution, Jules tells Vincent that he wants to walk the earth like Caine from Kung Fu. But Vincent takes no prisoners and tells him his plan is essentially to become a bum. And then of course we realize that Jules and Vincent are in the same diner as Pumpkin and Honey Bunny.
So you decided to be a bum?
I'll just be Jules, Vincent. No more, no less.
No, Jules, you decided to be a bum. Just like all those pieces of shit out there who beg for change, who sleep in garbage bins, and eat what I throw away. They got a name for that, Jules. It's called a bum. And without a job, a residence, or legal tender, that's what you're gonna be, man. You're gonna be a fucking bum.
Look, my friend, this is just where you and I differ.
Garçon! Coffee!
Jules, look.
It seems that no matter how hard he tries, Jules is surrounded by crime, selfishness, and evil. But then, the false resolution gives way to the true resolution. Pumpkin and Honey Bunny get to work, but Jules takes the upper hand, and from a position of power, he chooses not only to let them live, but to give them all of his money. He chooses to be the shepherd.
Maybe it means you're the evil man, and I'm the righteous man. And Mr. 9mm here, he's the shepherd protecting my righteous ass in the valley of darkness. Or it could mean you're the righteous man, and I'm the shepherd. And it's the world that's evil and selfish. Now, I'd like that. But that shit ain't the truth. The truth is, you're the weak, and I'm the tyranny of evil men. But I'm trying, Ringo. I'm trying real hard to be the shepherd.
In Act 1, he quoted Ezekiel 25:17 to murder someone. In Act 3, now a changed man, this is what he says to avoid murdering someone. Jules has embraced a new thematic argument, and one that defines the entire story of Pulp Fiction. Now, there's one more structure note that I'd like to make before I move on to the final section. I have the zeal of the converted when it comes to the idea of fractal structure. Basically, what that means is that the structure of any part of a story reflects the structure of the whole thing, and vice versa. So, now that we've seen that the overall story of Pulp Fiction has a pretty clear 5-act structure, hopefully, I'd like to run far too quickly through its 3 main stories and show how each one has its own tight internal structure that also has 5 acts. To begin, Vincent Vega and Marcellus Wallace's wife, our Act 2A. It's 42 minutes long, but we see the exact same 5-act structure at play. In Act 1, Vincent is teased about bringing Mia out and goes to buy heroin, so we have our story tension for this story's mini Act 2. Will Vincent end up sleeping with Mia Wallace? We have a mini Act 2A where Vincent arrives, Mia toys with him for a while, and the two first meet at our first unconscious move. Mini Act 2B then takes place in Jack Rabbit Slims, and at our exact midpoint, we have our first conscious move towards the character's need. Now, this story begins with Vincent determined to keep his distance from Mia, and Mia being very awkward and clearly self-conscious about human interaction. But it ends with Vincent and Mia shaking hands, having genuinely connected. So at minute 22, halfway through our 42-minute story, Vincent decides to ask the question that's really on his mind, and Mia is excited by the genuineness of it. This then triggers the honeymoon period where they tease each other and then, iconically, dance together. But then we move into Act 2C, the bridge to the low point, and shit gets real. Vincent struggles with his vice, selfishness, and Mia struggles with hers, a drug addiction that seems to stem at least partially from rampant insecurity. So, Vincent gives himself a talking to, and Mia accidentally snorts heroin, so it's safe to say they will not sleep together, and our mini Act 2 tension is resolved, but now there's this whole other really significant tension. So, clearly it's time for this story's mini Act 3. Vincent has managed to overcome his selfishness and was saying goodbye, but it doesn't seem like that will help him as Mia is now ODing. He's learnt his lesson, but it doesn't seem to matter. It is a classic low point. But, finally, the incredible climax. Vincent saves Mia's life with an adrenaline shot, and finally we end our story with Mia telling Vincent a joke that she was too insecure to tell him earlier, and Vincent shakes her hand and walks away. Our tension has been answered, and not only that, but our characters have changed their behaviors. They've had their own arcs. She made herself vulnerable, and Vincent did the right thing, at least by Vincent's standards. It's a complete story with relatively shallow but notable arcs and a clear 5 acts. Okay, so the Gold Watch. In our mini Act 1, we see the Watch's backstory and the taxi ride with Esmeralda, and this tells us where the character of Butch is starting from. He has this history of service running throughout his family, but he also callously does not feel the least bit of remorse for killing an opponent. But 12 minutes into our 48-minute story, Butch gets home, he leaves the classic femme fatale, weirdly fascinated with murder behind, and our first mini act is over. And you might notice it's around here where he has a phone call at a payphone, and he outlines what his plan actually is. And 16 minutes into our story, Butch soon makes a first unconscious move towards something better when he tells Fabienne that he wants to be with her and he gives her oral pleasure, a non-selfish sexual act. He has begun to change, and he wakes up to a new day. But 23 minutes into our 48-minute story, we have this story's midpoint. After having nightmares about violence, Butch realizes that Fabienne forgot his father's watch and decides to go back for it. And importantly, he at least tries to keep a lid on his fury towards his girlfriend. So, he has a kind of honeymoon period where it seems as though he might get to collect his watch unscathed. But then, violence re-enters his life when at minute 28 he mows down Vincent. The peaceful honeymoon is over, and we're now heading back towards a low point. And at minute 34, just as he thought he would be able to get his father's watch and return to his loving partner, he actually ends up with his worst enemy in a sex dungeon. So yeah, it appears he has failed in his objective of running away with Fabienne, and if this isn't a low point, I don't know what is. So, to recap for clarity, at the end of Act 1, Butch was on the run from violence. At the end of Act 2A, he was optionally giving someone else sexual pleasure. At the end of our larger Act 2, he's tied up and about to be the unwilling recipient of a violent sexual act. But of course, Butch frees himself and is free to run once again. But then, 40 minutes into our 48-minute story, we have our climactic decision. Butch decides not to run and to go back and save his enemy from a horrible fate. The honor and decency of his ancestry is calling him to do the right thing. So he's gone from somebody who did not give a shit about killing an opponent in the ring to someone who will now go out of his way to save an opponent's life. So he does, and in our final resolution, an exhausted, beaten Butch returns to Fabienne, retains his cool, and rides off into the sunset with his girl. Okay, finally, the Bonnie situation. Again here we have something similar. Our mini first act contains the inciting incident of the bullets missing Jules and Vincent, causing them to argue in the car, which has less than ideal results for poor Marvin. So now we have a tension. How are they going to get out of this? The mini act 2A involves coming up with the plan to go to Jimmy's. Then, 4 minutes later, Jimmy is pissed and concerned about his wife Bonnie discovering any of this. So the stakes are raised for Act 2B. But calls are made, and at our midpoint, foreshadowing the ending, the wolf arrives and he concocts his plan for the honeymoon period. But things aren't smooth for long. Vincent pushes back against the wolf, and our mini Act 2C is all about the really unpleasant tasks. So while Butch could go back for his father's watch, Jimmy is going to have to give up his good family linen for crime. And Jules appears to be struggling to feel the touch of God now that he's stuck cleaning up brain matter in a blood-soaked car with Vincent. Vincent, for his part, is feeling ungrateful and petulant. But finally, at minute 18, the car is clean, and in our final act and true resolution, Jules and Vincent are washed clean of this incident. So, our overall film has a classic 5-act structure, and we can see now that these shorter stories all also have a classic inbuilt tension and their own very tight 5-act structure as well. They all have a setup, a first unconscious move, a midpoint that foreshadows the climax, a complication, a low point, a climax, and a resolution. It's pretty neat, right? Okay, fine. We've got a 5-act structure, but that a great film does not make. I'm sure that if I overanalyzed any of Tarantino's films, they would have that. And, most films do. So why does Pulp Fiction feel like the ultimate Tarantino film? Why is this Tarantino's masterpiece? Why is it a masterpiece in general? Well, personally, I think it has everything to do with the relationship between the argument and the counter-argument, and how that relationship allows Tarantino's style to become substantive. As we've covered, I believe that Pulp Fiction is essentially about redemption, that a cold-blooded killer can change, and in doing so be absolved of his previous ill deeds. And well, apparently if he doesn't change, then he's likely to get mowed down by a submachine gun coming out of a toilet, which you could argue is the wrath of God. Okay, but what about the counter-argument? What is the counter-argument? Or to put it another way, what do Jules, Vincent, and Butch principally struggle against to attain their eventual need? What do they collectively believe at the start that they no longer believe at the end of their journey? Well, again, Jules pretty much tells us, right? First of all, he tells us through scripture that the path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. But not only that, Jules also reveals at the end that even after we've been told that, how do we know what it means? Maybe the gun is the thing that allows Jules to live in the valley, Or maybe the world is evil and selfish and Jules is the shepherd. Or maybe Jules is evil and prone to tyranny. It's hard to know. And it's hard to know because the world is so chaotic and there is so much darkness in it. That is the real counter-argument, and everything in Pulp Fiction makes that case. Everyone around our heroes is generally callous, casually cruel, and or racist. It gives the whole thing this sort of nihilistic feel. Where is the righteous man in need of shepherding? It's not easy to see. So, in that case, why not talk about McDonald's while on your way to murdering 3 to 4 people? Why not dismiss killing someone in a boxing ring? Why not try to schmooze your way through bringing a dead body to a suburban garage by talking about coffee? Nobody else seems to care, so why should they? And it's not only that the people seem cold and indifferent, so does life itself. None of Jules, Vincent, or Butch can see the whole story or really understand the chain of causality. For Vincent, the inciting incident is really the moment where he is not hit by those bullets, and the fact that he does not recognize that as a miracle. Now, this is a bit of a journey, but please bear with me. This leads to him arguing with Jules and his decision to quit, which leads to him shooting Marvin, which leads to him getting pissy with Jules and the wolf, which leads to him and Jules getting breakfast together, which leads to him being involved in a stick-up, which leads to him being pissed off when he arrives at Marcellus's club, which leads to him picking a fight with Butch, which arguably leads to Butch deciding not to throw the fight after all, which leads to Vincent staking out Butch's apartment, which leads to Vincent getting murdered. So, if Vincent believed that the bullet missing him was a miracle, he would not have eventually been hit by bullets. But, more directly, there's a decent chance that if he just wasn't acting like such a jerk afterwards, he would have lived. Or he might have lived, at least. But, it's hard for the characters to see that chain of causality. So the film makes it difficult for its audience to see the causality. Life appears chaotic and filled with chance moments, so does the film. And who knows whether these things are chance or not. Was it by chance that the guy was in the bathroom when Jules and Vincent arrived? Was it by chance that Lance had run out of balloons, which meant that he gave Vincent a baggie for his heroin, which meant that Mia mistook it for cocaine? Was it chance that Fabienne forgot the watch when she really seems to think she brought it? Was it chance that Marcellus left his gun on the counter and went for donuts while Vincent was on the toilet? Was it chance that Butch and Marcellus fell into the creepiest little pawn shop in LA, and that there was a Tennessean license plate by the door? And were those bullets missing really an act of God? Did Vincent's gun really just go off by itself like he swears it did? And what are the odds that Jules and Vincent end up in the same diner as Pumpkin and Honey Bunny on the same morning? We know the chain of causality for some things, but not for others. But the idea of fractured and limited perspectives is baked into the design of Pulp Fiction, both in its use of multiple protagonists and its fractured timeline. Life is chaotic and full of cruelty. Why not be nihilistic and just try to be, as cool as possible in the face of it all? That is Pulp Fiction's counter-argument. And that is Quentin Tarantino's modus operandi as a writer and director. So in this particular instance, Quentin Tarantino's style is the substance. They are just a perfect marriage. They are one and the same. And that is why I think some of his later films can be accused of being a bit boring, frankly, or a bit off kilter, and certainly can be accused of being self-indulgent, but Pulp Fiction can't. The film might appear to be loose and meaningless, but it is nothing of the sort. It is a film of focus and clarity. There are no rules being broken here. There are tools being used to reinforce the thematic resonance. The reason, in my view, the Pulp Fiction is a masterpiece is that it reaches that rare feat of true filmmaking. The film really has something to say, and in Pulp Fiction, the medium is the message. This has been Mark Overanalyzes Film. If you enjoyed this episode, please do recommend it to anyone you know who might like it too. It really would be a great help. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and bonsoirs.